Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. The computer screen illuminated Robert's face as he scrolled through yet another online forum. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating before typing out a response. The clock on the wall ticked away, a constant reminder of another lonely night spent in the confines of his apartment. Maybe today's the day, he whispered to himself, a habit born from years of solitude. Robert's gaze drifted to the closet door, slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of colorful fabrics and shoes that didn't quite match the rest of his wardrobe. He stood up, stretching his lanky frame, and padded over to the mirror hanging on the wall. The reflection staring back at him felt foreign, as it had for years. Short brown hair, stubble threatening to break through, and clothes that hung awkwardly on his body. He ran a hand through his hair, imagining it longer, softer. "Who are you kidding?" he muttered, turning away from the mirror. But the pull was too strong to ignore. Robert found himself opening the closet door, fingers trailing over silky blouses and flowing skirts. He pulled out a simple black dress, holding it up against his body. For a moment, he saw her, the woman he'd been hiding for so long. The dress slipped over his head easily, familiar after countless nights of secret dress-up sessions. He applied makeup with practiced hands, years of YouTube tutorials paying off. And finally, the wig-long chestnut waves that framed his face perfectly. Robert looked in the mirror again, and this time the reflection felt right. She smiled, a genuine expression that rarely graced her features. "Hello, Hadley," she whispered, trying out the name she'd chosen years ago. But the smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. Hadley glanced at her phone, silent and dark on the nightstand. No messages, no calls, no one to share this moment with. She sank onto the bed, the weight of loneliness settling over her like a heavy blanket. Hadley had known for years that this was who she truly was. But fear had kept her trapped in Robert's life. Fear of rejection, of losing what little connection she had to the world. "You can't live like this anymore," she told her reflection firmly. Hadley's hand shook as she reached for her phone. She opened her contacts, scrolling past names of people she barely spoke to anymore. Her finger hovered over Mom, but she couldn't bring herself to tap it. The memory of their last conversation about Robert's little hobby still stung. Instead, she opened a new text message and began typing. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to inquire about hormone replacement therapy and the process of medical transition." Hadley hit send before she could second-guess herself. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. She lay back on the bed, dress fanning out around her, and let out a shaky breath. "This is it," she whispered to the empty room. "No turning back now?" The next few weeks passed in a blur of appointments and paperwork. Hadley found herself sitting in sterile waiting rooms, filling out form after form. Each time she wrote Hadley instead of Robert, a little thrill went through her. The endocrinologist's office was no different. Hadley's leg bounced nervously as she waited, the crinkle of the paper gown loud in the quiet room. "Mr. Thompson?" a voice called. Hadley winced but stood up. "Actually, it's Miss Hadley Thompson." The nurse blinked, then smiled. "Of course, my apologies. Right this way, Miss Thompson." As Hadley followed the nurse, she couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and terror. This was really happening. She was taking control of her life, becoming who she was always meant to be. But as she sat through the consultation, nodding along to the doctor's explanations of hormones and their effects, a familiar ache settled in her chest. She glanced around the room, noting the photos of smiling families on the walls. "Do you have any questions?" the doctor asked, snapping Hadley out of her thoughts. No, I don't think so," she replied, forcing a smile. "All right then, we'll start you on a low dose and monitor your progress closely. Do you have someone who can help you keep track of any changes or side effects?" Hadley's smile faltered. "Oh, I'll manage." The doctor's expression softened. "There are support groups I can recommend if you'd like. It's important to have a network during this process." "Thanks," Hadley murmured, taking the offered pamphlet without really looking at it. As she left the office, prescription in hand, Hadley felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Pride at taking this step, excitement for the future, but also a deep, aching loneliness. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering over her mother's number again. But the memory of their last conversation stopped her. "You'll grow out of this phase, Robert. It's just a bit of fun, but you can't seriously think about changing yourself." Hadley shoved the phone back in her purse, blinking back tears. She'd have to do this alone, just like everything else. The first few months of hormone therapy were a roller coaster. Hadley documented every change meticulously, taking selfies in the mirror each week to track her progress. She noticed the subtle softening of her features, the way her body began to redistribute fat. But it was the emotional changes that caught her off guard. Hadley found herself crying at commercials, laughing more freely, feeling everything more intensely. It was overwhelming at times, especially with no one to talk to about it. She tried the support group the doctor had recommended, but felt out of place among the couples and families who attended. Hadley left early, the sound of laughter and shared experiences echoing in her ears as she walked home alone. Work became increasingly difficult as her appearance changed. Hadley had always kept to herself, but now she felt the stares and whispers follow her through the office. She overheard snatches of conversation in the break room. "Did you see Robert today? What's he trying to pull?" "I always thought he was a bit, you know." Hadley hunched over her desk, trying to make herself invisible. She'd known this would be hard, but the reality was so much worse than she'd imagined. One particularly rough day, Hadley found herself in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. The face looking back at her was softer, more feminine, but tears streaked her cheeks. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "You have to." A knock on the door startled her. "Robert, are you okay in there?" Hadley took a deep breath, steeling herself. "It's Hadley," she called back, voice shaking. And I'm fine." There was a long pause before her coworker responded. "Oh, okay, Hadley, the meeting's starting soon." "Thanks," Hadley replied, listening to the retreating footsteps. She splashed some water on her face and reapplied her makeup with trembling hands. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. As Hadley walked into the conference room, she held her head high despite the stares. She was done hiding. "Everyone," she announced, voice steadier than she felt. "I'd like you all to call me Hadley from now on. I'm transgender and I'm transitioning. I hope you can respect that." The silence that followed was deafening. Hadley's heart pounded in her chest as she took her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Finally, her manager cleared his throat. "Right. Well, let's get started with the quarterly report." The meeting passed in a blur. Hadley barely heard a word, too focused on controlling her breathing and not bursting into tears. As soon as it was over, she bolted for the door. "Hadley, wait!" She turned to see Sarah, a woman from accounting she'd barely spoken to before, hurrying after her. "I just wanted to say, that was really brave. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Hadley blinked in surprise. Thank you. That means a lot." It wasn't much, but it was a start. A tiny crack in the wall of loneliness she'd built around herself. As the months passed, Hadley's confidence grew along with her changing body. She began to experiment more with her style, embracing the feminine clothing she'd always longed to wear openly. Her wardrobe expanded, filled with soft fabrics and bright colors that made her feel alive. One Saturday morning, Hadley stood in front of her closet, running her hands over the clothes with a smile. She pulled out a flowy sundress, holding it up to herself in the mirror. "Perfect for a day out," she mused aloud. The realization hit her suddenly. When was the last time she'd actually gone out? Not for work or errands, but just to enjoy herself. Hadley couldn't remember. She got dressed with a new sense of purpose, applying her makeup carefully and styling her now shoulder-length hair. As she gave herself a final once-over in the mirror, Hadley barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the hesitant, fearful person she'd been. In her place stood someone confident, someone ready to embrace life. Time to start living, Hadley told her reflection firmly. She grabbed her purse and headed out, the warm summer sun greeting her as she stepped onto the sidewalk. For a moment, the old fear crept in. What if people stared? What if they knew? But Hadley took a deep breath and pushed those thoughts aside. She was done hiding. Her feet carried her to a nearby park, alive with the sounds of families enjoying the weekend. Hadley found an empty bench and sat down, content to people-watch for a while. A group of children ran by, laughing as they chased a frisbee. An elderly couple walked hand in hand down the path. And everywhere, people just living their lives, unbothered by her presence. Hadley felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She'd spent so long isolating herself, convinced that the world would reject her. But here she was, just another face in the crowd. As the afternoon wore on, Hadley's stomach growled. She realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast, too nervous about going out to think about food. Looking around, she spotted a small cafe across the street from the park. "Might as well," she murmured, standing up and smoothing down her dress. The cafe was bustling with activity, the aroma of coffee and freshly baked goods filling the air. Hadley joined the line, scanning the menu board above the counter. "What can I get for you?" the barista asked when it was her turn. Hadley opened her mouth to order, then hesitated. In the past, she would have gotten her usual black coffee and hurried out, but today felt different. "I'll have a vanilla latte, please," she said, surprising herself. "And one of those blueberry muffins." "Great choice," the barista smiled. "Can I get a name for the order?" "Hadley," she replied, the name feeling natural on her tongue. As Hadley waited for her order, she couldn't help but notice a man sitting alone at a nearby table. He glanced up, catching her eye, and smiled. Hadley felt a flutter in her stomach, quickly looking away. "Vanilla latte for Hadley." She collected her order and, after a moment's hesitation, chose a table by the window instead of leaving. As she sipped her latte, Hadley found herself stealing glances at the man who had smiled at her. He was handsome, with kind eyes and a book open in front of him. Hadley wondered what he was reading, what his story might be. For the first time in a long time, she felt curious about another person, interested in making a connection. But the old fears crept in. What if he realized she was trans? What if he reacted badly? Hadley shook her head, trying to dispel the negative thoughts. She was done living in fear. Taking a deep breath, she stood up and approached his table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice only shaking slightly. "I couldn't help but notice the book you're reading. Is it any good?" The man looked up, surprise giving way to a warm smile. "Oh, it's fantastic. Have you read any of the author's other works?" And just like that, Hadley found herself engaged in conversation. They talked about books, then movies, then their favorite spots in the city. Before she knew it, an hour had passed. "I'm Landon, by the way," he said, extending his hand. "Hadley," she replied, shaking it. "It's nice to meet you, Landon." As they continued talking, Hadley felt a warmth spreading through her chest. This was what she'd been missing, genuine human connection. And for once, she wasn't worried about being found out or rejected. She was just herself, Hadley, enjoying a conversation with an interesting person. When they finally parted ways, exchanging numbers with promises to meet up again, Hadley felt like she was walking on air. She'd taken a chance, pushed past her fears, and it had paid off. As she made her way home, Hadley couldn't stop smiling. The city around her seemed brighter somehow, full of possibility. She'd spent so long hiding away, convinced that transitioning meant giving up any chance at connection or love. But today had shown her that wasn't true. There was a whole world out there waiting for her to explore it. And maybe, just maybe, there were people out there who would accept her for who she truly was. Hadley unlocked her apartment door, kicking off her shoes with a contented sigh. She caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror and paused. The woman looking back at her was glowing, eyes bright with excitement and hope. "Hello, Hadley," she whispered to her reflection. "Welcome to your life." For the first time in as long as she could remember, Hadley fell asleep that night without feeling lonely. Instead, she drifted off with a smile on her face, dreaming of new possibilities and connections waiting to be made. The next few weeks passed in a blur of newfound confidence and small, everyday adventures. Hadley found herself venturing out more often, exploring parts of the city she'd never bothered with before. She tried new cafes, browsed bookstores, and even joined a local art class. Each time she stepped outside her comfort zone, Hadley felt a little stronger, a little more herself. The stares that had once paralyzed her now barely registered. She walked with her head held high, finally comfortable in her own skin. Work, too, had become easier. While not everyone was fully supportive, the outright hostility had faded. Hadley found unexpected allies in coworkers like Sarah, who made a point of using her correct name and pronouns. One afternoon, as Hadley was packing up to leave the office, her phone buzzed with a text message. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw it was from Landon. "Hey, Hadley, there's an indie film festival happening this weekend. Want to check it out together?" Hadley bit her lip, excitement warring with anxiety. They'd texted back and forth since their cafe meeting, but hadn't seen each other in person again. Was this a date? And if it was, should she tell him about her past? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, mind racing. Finally, she took a deep breath and typed out a response. "Sounds great, I'd love to go." As she hit send, Hadley felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. She was really doing this, going on what might be a date with someone who had no idea about her journey. The next few days were a whirlwind of anticipation and preparation. Hadley spent hours trying on different outfits, wanting to look perfect but not like she was trying too hard. She practiced her makeup, styled her hair, and rehearsed potential conversations in the mirror. When Saturday finally arrived, Hadley was a bundle of nerves. She arrived at the theater early, pacing back and forth in front of the entrance. "Hadley?" She turned to see Landon approaching, a warm smile on his face. He looked even more handsome than she remembered, dressed in a casual button-down shirt and jeans. "You look beautiful," he said as he reached her, leaning in to kiss her cheek. Hadley felt her face flush. "Thank you. You look great, too." As they entered the theater, Landon's hand found the small of her back, guiding her gently. The touch sent shivers up Hadley's spine, both thrilling and terrifying. They found their seats just as the lights dimmed. As the first film began to play, Hadley was hyper-aware of Landon's presence beside her. Their arms brushed on the shared armrest, and she could smell his cologne, a subtle, woodsy scent that made her want to lean in closer. Throughout the evening, they whispered comments about the films, laughing quietly at the more absurd moments. During a particularly emotional scene, Hadley felt Landon's hand cover hers. She turned her palm up, intertwining their fingers. By the time they left the theater, hand in hand, Hadley felt like she was floating. They walked aimlessly through the city streets, talking about the films they'd seen and life in general. "I'm really glad you agreed to come out tonight," Landon said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Hadley smiled up at him. "Me too. I've had a wonderful time." They stopped at a small park, sitting down on a bench overlooking a fountain. The night air was cool, and Hadley shivered slightly. Without hesitation, Landon shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "Thank you," Hadley murmured, touched by the gesture. As they sat there, Landon's arm around her shoulders, Hadley felt a contentment she'd never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen and appreciated for who she was. but a nagging voice in the back of her mind wouldn't let her fully relax. She needed to tell him the truth. He deserved to know, and she couldn't bear the thought of building a relationship on a lie. "Landon," she said softly, turning to face him, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked at her, concern crossing his features. "Is everything okay?" Hadley took a deep breath, steeling herself. I'm transgender. I've been transitioning for the past year. I hope that doesn't change anything, but I understand if it does." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Hadley's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for Landon's reaction, preparing herself for rejection. Finally, Landon spoke. "Hadley, thank you for trusting me enough to share that. It doesn't change how I feel about you at all. You're an incredible woman, and I'm honored to know you." Tears welled up in Hadley's eyes. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear those words, how desperately she'd longed for acceptance. Landon reached out, gently wiping away a tear that had escaped. "Can I kiss you?" he asked softly. Hadley nodded, not trusting her voice. As Landon's lips met hers, she felt something inside her heal. Years of loneliness and fear melted away, replaced by hope and the promise of something beautiful. Thanks for watching. The rest won't be viewable on YouTube, so check out Patreon if you want more.